An unsolved cold case from the Bronx in 1999 went unanswered for over 2 decades. A witness didn't find her killer. He wasn't caught because someone talked. He was found because of a dead man's DNA, a man who had been in the ground for years before anyone even knew to look for his son. Everyone assumed the killer was a stranger, someone who grabbed her off the street, someone who was never going to be found. He wasn't a stranger. He lived 2 floors above her. He knew her face. He had spoken to police. And for 22 years he walked completely free, not hiding, not running. Living his life in public, in plain sight, around children. This case didn't just destroy one family, it permanently changed how New York City hunts killers, and it forced the entire state to answer a question it wasn't ready for. Her name was Minor Liz Soriano. Everyone called her Minnie. She was born in Puerto Rico in January 1986. When she was 8 years old, her father put her on a plane to New York. She landed in the Bronx with her mother Minerva, her stepfather Ray Robles, and eventually her little sister Nadia. They lived at 1540 Pelham Parkway South, a high-rise apartment in Co-op City, one of the largest housing developments in the entire world. 35 towers, 50,000 people, kids on every floor, in every elevator, in every stairwell. Minnie ran that building. She was 13 years old and already carrying the weight of an adult. She biked to the 24-hour deli at midnight to pick up groceries for her parents. She did the family laundry. She babysat Nadia. She took out the garbage. A neighbor named Judy Vicente watched the 13-year-old haul heavy laundry bags and groceries up the elevators, noting that Minnie never complained, not once. She just carried the weight and kept moving. At school, she was straight up. Her teachers called her bright, mature, far beyond what they expected from a 7th grader. But spend 5 minutes with her and you'd forget all of that because she was also completely joyfully 13. She roller skated around the neighborhood, she read teenage romance novels, she wrote poetry, and she carried a journal everywhere, a small notebook filled with the future she had already planned out in detail. The boyfriend who would pull up in a Ferrari, the proposal, the wedding, the house, the children. She had it all mapped out. Her best friend was a girl named Kimberly Ortiz. They met in 7th grade and locked in immediately, both obsessed with books, both getting in trouble in the library for being too loud, both writing about their futures and comparing notes. One afternoon, they were in a corner store together and spotted 2 matching rings sitting on the counter. They bought them right there, ripped the package open on the sidewalk, slid them on without going home first. Best friend rings. Minnie wore hers every single day. And then at some point, the journal started to change. Minnie had started talking about the stars, about rockets and deep space. She told Kimberly she wanted a telescope for her 14th birthday, that she was going to be an astronaut. Kimberly laughed. "We're from the Bronx," she told her. "We're not going to be astronauts." But Minnie didn't laugh back. She was completely serious. February 24th, 1999 was a cold Wednesday. The temperature barely crept above freezing. Minnie left IS 135 at around 2:20 in the afternoon. Kimberly was standing right there and told her to stay. They had their after-school reading program, and Kimberly's mother had already gotten upset once about them skipping it. Minnie said no. She wanted to leave. Kimberly gave her a hug, watched her walk toward the bus stop. That was the last time she saw her alive. Kimberly still replays that moment every single day. Minnie's routine was always the same. Take the BX12 bus, stop near Nadia's elementary school, pick up her little sister, walk home together. That afternoon, 7-year-old Nadia stood outside her elementary school, waiting for the sister who always came. The bell rang. The other kids left. The sidewalk emptied. Minnie never came. Eventually, a terrified 7-year-old turned around and walked home alone in the freezing cold. When Nadia arrived without her sister, the family knew immediately something was wrong. They searched the neighborhood. They called everyone they could think of. By 7 p.m., they called the police. An officer came to the apartment, took the report, and told them not to worry. She probably ran off with friends, probably just lost track of time. Her family knew that wasn't true. Minnie had a routine she never broke, a little sister she never left behind, and a home she always came back to. For 4 days, nobody found anything. Search parties formed and walked the same streets over and over. Flyers went up across the neighborhood. Minnie's school photo, her description, an $11,000 reward. Detectives canvassed every block between her school and her building. They interviewed bus drivers, classmates, teachers, every neighbor they could reach. The days stretched out for that family in a way that is almost impossible to describe. Every knock on the door, every phone call, every hour that passed without news making the next hour heavier than the last. On February 28th, a homeless man was going through the dumpsters behind Hollywood Video on Bartow Avenue. He opened a heavy black bag. He saw a face. He dropped everything and ran to find help. Minnie's body had been concealed inside a heavy bag and left 2 miles from her apartment. She had been severely assaulted and strangled. The medical examiner would determine she died from compression of the neck. She would have been overpowered quickly, with very little time to fight back. She was fully clothed when she was found, but her red ski jacket and black Jansport backpack were gone, almost certainly taken because they held more evidence. She had been placed in that dumpster deliberately, carefully by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The best friend ring she had ripped open on the sidewalk was still on her finger. On her sweatshirt, investigators found a single trace of biological evidence, a DNA profile. They ran it through every database available in 1999. The system came back completely blank. No match, no name. Just 22 years of absolute silence, dozens of detectives, hundreds of leads, a piece of DNA with no face attached to it. The trail went completely cold until one detective took the case in 2011 and made a promise standing over Minnie's grave. What he found hiding inside that building would make the entire city go silent. 3 days after Minnie's body was found, the NYPD formed a task force. Not 2 detectives assigned to a cold file, a full task force. Dozens of investigators pulled from precincts across the Bronx, all focused on one case. Detective Bernard Ryan at the 45th Precinct led the charge. They were certain they were going to break the case within days. They were wrong. They canvassed every block between IS 135 and Pelham Parkway South. They walked the exact route Minnie would have taken. They knocked on doors in every building along the way. They interviewed every bus driver on the BX12 route, the bus Minnie was known to take home from school. They tracked down every surveillance camera in the surrounding area and pulled whatever footage existed. There were almost no cameras. This was 1999 in a residential stretch of the Bronx. The streets weren't watched. They interviewed Minnie's classmates, her teachers, every neighbor on her block. They went back and canvassed again, then again. One detective would later describe the experience in a single sentence that captures the whole nightmare. We could not find one person who could put her in front of that building that day. She had made it off the bus. She had been seen near her stop, and then she simply ceased to exist, somewhere in a gap of less than 2 blocks between the sidewalk and her front door. That gap became everything. The building at 1540 Pelham Parkway South became the center of the investigation. Detectives went door to door through every floor. They treated every male resident as a potential suspect, not out of suspicion of any one person, but because there was no other direction to look. They collected statements. They searched for inconsistencies. They looked for anyone whose story didn't hold. The building had dozens of men living inside it. Without a DNA comparison to anchor their focus, every interview led to the same result. Nothing. The one piece of evidence they had was the biological sample found on Minnie's sweatshirt. In 2000, it was packaged and sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. The sample was run through CODIS, the national DNA database, which held the profiles of convicted criminals across the country. The result came back negative. No match anywhere in the system. Over the following years, as new persons of interest surfaced through tips and leads, investigators manually compared the DNA to 13 convicted sex offenders. One by one, every single one was excluded. The evidence went back into storage. The case went cold. The family never stopped. Minnie's Aunt Amelia gave interviews, made public appeals, kept her niece's name in front of anyone who would listen. Her cousin Omar, who had braided her hair when she was small, who had walked her to elementary school back when she was just learning the neighborhood, spoke to reporters whenever a door opened. Her father, Luis, dialed the precinct from Texas month after month, tracking a paper trail that was rapidly freezing over with every passing year. The voices on the other end of the line grew more distant. Kimberly Ortiz, now grown, typed Minnie's name into a search engine one afternoon. The results came back empty. No articles, no updates, no movement. She stared at the screen. I said, "Oh my God," she recalled later. They forgot about her. They hadn't, but it must have felt exactly like that. In 2011, 12 years after the murder, Detective Malcolm Raymond was handed the file. Raymond didn't work ordinary homicides. He had spent his career specializing in the worst category of cases: sexual predators, serial offenders, crimes against children that had gone cold for years. He requested every piece of physical evidence from storage. He sat down with 22 boxes of accumulated material, reports, witness statements, interview transcripts, forensic records, and read every single page from the beginning. His theory formed quickly. Minnie hadn't been taken off the street. She had made it back to the building. He was certain of it. She was a latchkey kid, no key of her own, which meant she came home and waited in the lobby, sitting on the floor doing her homework until someone arrived to let her in. She sold candy door to door through every floor of the building to raise money for her school. She ran errands through the common hallways. She was not invisible inside those walls. She was a girl that the men in that building had every reason to recognize by face. Ryman ran the numbers. In 1999, there were 43 men living in that building who were old enough and physically capable of committing this crime. Every single one had been interviewed during the original canvass. Not one had produced anything useful. He began the methodical work of trying to obtain voluntary DNA from all 43. At the same time, he started pushing for something that had never been done in a New York City case: a new forensic technique, one that didn't require the killer's DNA to be in any database. A way to find a murderer, not by matching his profile directly, but by finding someone who shared his blood. Every 30 days, Ryman submitted a formal written request to the crime lab asking for permission to use it. The request came back unanswered every time. He submitted it again and again. For 6 straight months, the wall didn't move. On the 7th month, the lab chief read the full case file himself. He called Ryman. He said yes. What Ryman didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the answer had never actually left that building. It was there in 1999 when detectives first knocked on doors. It was there in 2011 when Ryman started reading those 22 boxes. Every single day this case sat unsolved, the answer was sitting one floor above where Ryman's theory placed it. In 1999, the night before Minnie's funeral, Ryman stood over her in the morgue. She was 13 years old. He reached out and touched her hand, and he made her a promise. "I will find out who did this to you." He would work this case for years. He would retire. He would be 3 years out of the job before he learned he had kept it. In 2019, the lab ran that original DNA profile through a system no New York detective had ever used before. It didn't look for the killer. It looked for someone who shared his blood. And what came back wasn't a name. It was a ghost, a dead man. And from that dead man, a trail led directly to the person who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Familial DNA does not look for the killer. That is the first thing to understand. It doesn't need his profile in any database. It doesn't need him to have ever been arrested. It looks for someone close enough to share his blood: a father, a brother, a son. The software takes the unknown DNA and runs it against 7 lakh convicted offenders in New York's database, not searching for a direct hit, but for a partial one, the kind of match that says whoever left this evidence is related to someone already in this system. In 2019, after the joint application from the NYPD and the Bronx DA's office was finally approved, the system ran the forensic sample from Minnie's sweatshirt, the same sample that had been sitting in storage since 1999, and returned a result. Not a direct match, a partial one. Close enough to be a first-order relative, close enough to be family. The man in the database was already dead. He had been convicted years earlier, not for murder, not for anything connected to Minnie, but for sexual abuse. His DNA was in the system because of that arrest. He had lived out the rest of his life and died before any of this began. He had no idea that the profile sitting in a government database under his name would one day reach back across the grave and point directly at his son. But it did. Investigators built the family tree. The dead man had 5 sons. 2 were immediately eliminated. Both were too young in February 1999, children themselves at the time of the murder, physically impossible as suspects. That left 3. Detectives pulled everything they could find on all 3 men: address history, employment records, criminal history, and the one question that mattered more than any other: where was each of them living in February 1999? 2 of the 3 had no connection to Minnie's building. The third one stopped everything cold. Address records showed he had been living at 1540 Pelham Parkway South in 1999. The exact building, the same floors, the same elevators, the same lobby where Minnie sat doing her homework waiting for someone to bring a key. Detectives pulled the original case files, the 22 boxes Ryman had read through 8 years earlier, and searched for his name in the March 1999 Canvas records. It was already there. He had been interviewed. He told detectives he remembered seeing the girl in the lobby, said he'd seen her getting mail, remembered her selling candy door to door through the building. He said he had never touched her. The detective wrote it down. They moved on. He was 27 years old. He gave them nothing to hold on to, and they had no reason to look closer. His name was Joseph Martinez. Detectives could not arrest him yet. A familial match is not a conviction, it is a direction. To make an arrest, they needed his DNA directly. A sample taken from him personally, confirmed against the semen on Minnie's sweatshirt. But asking him to submit voluntarily would show their hand. If Martinez knew they were watching, he could run, he could disappear. He had already gone undetected for 22 years. He knew how to be invisible when it mattered. So they built a trap using the one thing they knew he would never refuse. By 2021, Joseph Martinez had spent years building a public identity around a single passion. He called himself Jupiter Joe. He took his telescope out to parks, to sidewalks, to subway stations across New York City, and he offered free lessons to anyone who stopped. Adults, families, and especially children. He had a website. He had a calendar of upcoming events. He had a YouTube channel. He was, by every visible measure, a warm and accessible community figure whose entire purpose seemed to be getting kids excited about the night sky. An undercover detective posed as a mother. She contacted Jupiter Joe through his public booking channels and told him she was looking to arrange an astronomy event for her daughter. Martinez responded. He was friendly, enthusiastic, exactly what his public persona promised. They arranged to meet at a diner in New Rochelle, where Martinez was living at the time, to discuss the details. The undercover arrived. They sat down. At some point during the meeting, she made her excuses and left early. Martinez stayed. He ordered a soda. He ordered water. He drank both through a straw. He sat at the table for a while longer, then got up and walked out of the diner without any idea of what had just happened. Detectives moved in and recovered the straws from the table. The lab ran the DNA extracted from those straws against the original sample collected from Minnie's sweatshirt in 1999, preserved in an evidence bag for 22 years, waiting for exactly this moment. The result came back as an exact match, not a partial, not a probable. An exact, conclusive, scientifically irrefutable match. One person in the world produces that DNA profile, one person, and his name was on those straws. On November 29, 2021, 22 years, 9 months, and 5 days after Minnie Soriano disappeared on her way home from school, detectives arrived at Joseph Martinez's home on Memorial Highway in New Rochelle. He was taken into custody without resistance. No struggle, no flight. He went quietly. Retired Detective Ryman, 3 years out of the job, drove to the precinct anyway. He just wanted to see it. He stood at the door and watched Martinez walk out in handcuffs. He had made a promise in a morgue in 1999. He had just learned he kept it. But when detectives pulled up Martinez's online presence that same week, his YouTube channel, his social media, his website full of upcoming children's events, the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the arrest. Because the man who had just been charged with killing a girl who dreamed of the stars had spent 2 full decades building a public life around putting telescopes in the hands of children. And that raised a question nobody in that room was ready to answer. Before the charges are read, before the courtroom, before any of that, stop, because to understand what this arrest meant, you need to understand who Joseph Martinez was to the rest of the world. Not to Minnie, not to her family, to everyone else. He grew up poor in the Bronx. Same borough, same towers, same streets as Minnie. As a child, his father gave him a pair of binoculars. That was the gift that started everything. A cheap pair of binoculars and a sky full of things he couldn't name yet. His family couldn't afford books, so he went to the library and taught himself. He learned the constellations. He learned the planets. He learned what was out there, past the rooftops of Co-op City, past the light pollution and the noise and the concrete, in the dark between stars. After 1999, he left the Bronx. He moved to New Rochelle, a quieter city just north of the borough. He got married. He had daughters. And when his daughters grew old enough to look up at the night sky and ask what was out there, he bought his first telescope for them. That telescope became the center of something larger. In 2011, Jupiter Joe's sidewalk astronomy was born. He started taking that telescope out into public spaces: Bronx parks, subway exits, sidewalks in Manhattan, Union Square on busy afternoons with hundreds of people walking past. He would set up the equipment, aim it at whatever was visible, and invite strangers to look through the lens for free. No charge, no agenda, just the sky. Children would stop and press their faces to the eyepiece and gasp. Adults who hadn't thought about the stars since childhood would slow down and stay for 20 minutes. He was warm. He was patient. He was exactly the kind of person you wanted your kid to talk to. He appeared on local news. He earned a corporate sponsorship. He spoke at the Northeast Astronomy Forum alongside professional astronomers who treated him as a peer. His YouTube channel grew: time-lapses of the night sky, interviews with young people who wanted to learn, recommendations for beginner equipment. His Facebook page described his mission as bringing sidewalk astronomy to children and their families all over the Bronx. People who met him at public events described him the same way: a fantastic guy. Someone who made you feel like the universe was personally inviting you in. This was the man detectives were looking at on their screens when the DNA hit came back, and their first reaction was not relief. It was not satisfaction. It was a question that had nothing to do with Minnie Soriano and everything to do with what this man had been doing for a decade. A grown man whose entire public identity was built around one thing: getting children to come look through his lens. LTN. O'Toole said it plainly. When detectives saw those videos, saw the calendar full of upcoming children's events, saw the YouTube channel and the sponsorships and the school visits, they immediately flagged 2 to 3 other open cases they wanted to investigate alongside Martinez. Because a man who had committed this crime and then spent 20 years building a public persona around youth education was someone investigators needed to look at very carefully. Those investigations are ongoing. Their outcomes have not been made public. After the arrest, investigators went back into evidence storage and pulled Minnie's notebooks. The small ones she carried everywhere, filled with her handwriting, her plans, her future. Her teachers remembered them. Kimberly remembered them. They were the notebooks where she had written about the Ferrari and the proposal and the children she was going to have someday. But when detectives read through them after Martinez's name surfaced, they found something that had meant nothing in 1999, because in 1999 there was nothing to connect it to. At some point in the months before she died, the notebooks changed, the romance novels gave way to something else. The poetry shifted. Minnie had started writing about astronomy, about rockets, about deep space and the names of planets, and what it would feel like to leave the atmosphere. She was the girl who had told Kimberly she wanted a telescope for her birthday. The girl who had said, completely seriously, that she was going to be an astronaut. At the time, it had seemed like a new dream replacing an old one. After the arrest, it looked like something else entirely. Detectives could not confirm that Minnie had ever met Jupiter Joe before February 24th. They could not prove he had introduced himself through the telescope, that he had used the stars as an entry point, that the shift in her notebooks was connected to the man living 2 floors above her. There was no evidence to confirm it. But the question once formed in that room could not be unformed. It sits in this case permanently, unanswered. Did the stars become the lure? It is a question that haunts the edges of the case, especially for those who were closest to him. In the days following the arrest, one of Martinez's daughters said publicly that she still didn't know how to reconcile the two halves of her reality: the individual named in the indictment and the father who had built her entire childhood around wonder, around the idea that the universe was something to move toward, not away from. For 22 years, he had balanced those two halves perfectly. Nobody from Minnie's family ever remembered his face, even though he had lived just 2 floors above them. But the silence finally ended in 2025. When Martinez entered that Bronx courtroom, he maintained his absolute innocence. His defense team had a theory, one that asked the jury to believe that the forensic science itself had made a catastrophic mistake. And for a few days, inside that courtroom, it almost sounded plausible, almost. September 25, 2025, Bronx Supreme Court. Joseph Martinez walked into that courtroom 54 years old, gray at the temples, wearing a suit. He sat down at the defense table, reached into a bag, and took out a notepad. Then he uncapped a pen and started writing. 26 years had passed since Minnie Soriano's body was found 2 miles from her front door. The case had outlasted careers, retirements, and court rulings that had threatened to make the very science that caught him illegal. And now, finally, it was here. ADA John Mears opened for the prosecution. He didn't rush. He laid it out piece by piece. The biological stain on the sweatshirt, collected in 1999 and preserved in an evidence bag for 26 years. The familial DNA system that returned a partial match to a dead man, the family tree. The 5 sons, the one whose 1999 address matched the building, the undercover detective, the diner, the straws, the exact match. 16 pieces of physical evidence entered on day 1 alone. The prosecution's argument rested on a single scientific fact that did not bend. One person in the world produces that specific DNA profile. One, and his DNA was on that little girl's sweatshirt. Then defense attorney Troy Smith stood up. His argument was not emotional. It was not a character attack. It was technical, surgical, and aimed at a single point of vulnerability in the prosecution's case, and he had clearly spent years sharpening it. He told the jury that the stain on Minnie's sweatshirt had never actually been definitively categorized without a forensic scientist physically validating the exact nature of the fluid under full magnification. He argued the prosecution could only call it an ambiguous biological fluid. Then he painted a picture for the jury. 2 neighbors, 1 building, flu season, a crowded elevator, a cough, a sneeze, mucus transferring in the ordinary way that germs travel in a dense residential building where 50,000 people share walls and air. He said the word the prosecution had been building toward, reasonable doubt, and he said it clearly. He told the jury the standard was not probability. It was certainty beyond reasonable doubt, and he asked them whether they could reach that standard based on a protein test alone. The judge reinforced it from the bench, repeatedly across multiple days, the burden of proof, the standard, reasonable doubt. The jury was listening. The room was very quiet. The defense went further. They raised Ray Robles, Minnie's stepfather, and pointed to the absence of any deep investigation into the family home as a structural gap in the original 1999 inquiry. They challenged the chain of custody for a biological sample that had been sitting in storage for over 2 decades, passing through multiple hands across multiple facilities. They questioned why a 13-year-old girl had been allowed to move through that building alone and unsupervised, implying the environment around her had been overlooked from the very beginning. Every argument was designed to do the same thing: introduce uncertainty, widen the crack, make the jury feel that what seemed obvious might not be certain. Then Kimberly Ortiz took the stand. She had been waiting 26 years for this room. She described Minnie the way only a best friend can, not as a victim, not as a case number, but as a specific, irreplaceable person. She told the jury about the dream of becoming an astronaut. She described the last ordinary morning, the after-school program, the conversation at the door, the hug at 2:20 p.m. on February 24, 1999, watching Minnie walk toward the bus stop. The jury watched Kimberly the entire time she spoke. Nobody in that courtroom looked away. On day 2, the prosecution called its 3rd witness. She was a DNA expert who had worked at the office of the chief medical examiner since 1999, since the year the evidence was first collected. She had examined the stain on Minnie's sweatshirt under a microscope. She had looked at it directly, with full magnification, the way the defense had spent 2 days insisting had never been done. She confirmed the exact, undeniable nature of the assault sample. It wasn't an everyday protein, and it wasn't an ambiguous fluid. It was definitive proof. The defense's entire architecture, the flu season, the elevator, the cough, the sneeze, the shared air of a crowded residential building, collapsed in a single sentence from a single witness. Everything Troy Smith had constructed across those opening days came down in one answer to one question. The prosecution's closing didn't soften it. Give me one valid reason why a 27-year-old man's biological DNA is on the sweatshirt of a 13-year-old girl. If you can explain that, the argument falls. You cannot explain it. You have scientific proof of direct contact. The jury deliberated for several days. Minnie's aunt, who had sat in that courtroom for every single day of the trial without missing one, waited. Kimberly waited. The family waited. The days moved slowly in the way they always do when something this heavy is in someone else's hands. November 14, 2025, the jury returned. Guilty. 2 counts of second-degree murder, intentional and felony murder, both counts, the science held. The DNA spoke for a girl who had been silent for 26 years. Martinez received the verdict with almost no visible reaction. He would be forced to return to this courtroom in March, to sit across from Minnie's family one final time, while they looked directly at him and said everything they had been waiting 26 years to say. He had spent all that time living a full life. Now the only question left was what a judge decides to call justice on the other side of that. The answer lay in one final confrontation, and in the closing words of a childhood friend who had been carrying a promise for nearly 3 decades. March 26, 2026, Bronx Hall of Justice. The family walked in for the last time. Minnie's aunt took her seat, the same seat she had occupied every single day of the trial, without exception, for weeks. Luis Soriano sat down, the father who had lost his daughter twice. The first time when her mother moved without telling him, cutting off every connection he had to his child. The second time on February 24, 1999, when Minnie never came home from school. He had spent years not even knowing where she was buried. Now he was sitting 20 feet from the man who put her there. Kimberly Ortiz sat down. She was 13 years old when she gave Minnie that hug outside as 135. She is 40 now. 27 years of replaying a 2-second moment at a school door, wondering what would have happened if she had held on a little longer. Martinez was brought in. He sat at the defense table for the last time. The family spoke first. Luis Soriano was handed an interpretation device. He primarily speaks Spanish, and the court provided translation. When defense attorney Troy Smith rose to address the court on his client's behalf, Luis reached up and removed the earpiece. He set it on the table in front of him. He would not listen to this man argue for the person who killed his daughter. Not today. Not after 27 years of waiting for this room. When it was his turn to speak, Luis looked at the court and delivered one sentence that needed no translation. We need to keep Joseph Martinez in the deepest pit of the abyss for the rest of his life. Minnie's aunt broke down completely. She had visited the grave every single week since 1999. Every week, for 27 years, she had gone to stand over a 13-year-old girl who should have grown up. She had never stopped going. She was not going to stop now. Then Kimberly Ortiz stood up. She looked around that courtroom at the detectives who had spent decades on this case, at the lawyers who had argued it for months at the family she had grown up alongside, at the man sitting in the chair who had taken her best friend and then lived a full life while Minnie stayed 13 forever. And she spoke directly into all of it. My friend has been in the ground for 27 years. He got to live life. He got to get married. He got to have kids. And my friend was buried in the ground. Martinez was given his turn. He stood and addressed the court with the same composure he had maintained through the entire trial. Even now, facing sentencing, I still hold true to my convictions. That said, I wholeheartedly disagree with the jury's verdict. He offered condolences to the family. He said he was sorry for their pain. Nobody in the family looked at him while he spoke. Bronx Supreme Court Justice Audrey Stone looked at the man in front of her and delivered the sentence with a single line that cut through everything. This was a girl who had a bright future, and it was stolen. 25 years to life. Both counts. Concurrent. He would have to serve every day of 25 years before he was even eligible to ask for release. He was 54 years old. Outside the courthouse, DA Darcel Clark spoke to the cameras. Minnerliz's dream of flying to the stars as an astronaut was dashed, but her light will never dim. But the story of what Minnie's case did to this city did not begin and end in that courtroom. It had been fighting long before sentencing day arrived, and it almost lost. In May 2022, a New York appellate court blocked familial DNA searching entirely. The ruling called it a government overreach, a tool implemented without legislative approval that disproportionately targeted Black and Latino New Yorkers because the criminal database it searched was built overwhelmingly from communities of color. The court cited the Martinez case in its own ruling, acknowledged that the technology worked, acknowledged that it had caught a killer, and still ruled that the decision to use it had never been properly authorized by the state legislature. The very tool that found Minnie's killer was declared invalid less than a year after his arrest. The Martinez prosecution continued. His search warrant had been issued in 2019 before the ban and was legally protected. But the gate his case had opened for every other unsolved murder in New York City nearly swung shut before it was ever fully used. In October 2023, New York's highest court reversed the decision and reinstated familial DNA searching. The gate stayed open. But it had taken a 2-year legal war to keep it that way. Detective Ryman, who had sent that request to the crime lab every 30 days for 6 months to get this technology approved in the first place. Put it simply, This little girl opened up a gate for future resolutions on nightmarish homicides that otherwise would never have been solved. Minnie's case didn't just survive the legal battle, it became the proof that the battle was worth fighting. There are two best friend rings in this story. Two girls in a corner store somewhere in the Bronx in 1998, spotting them on a counter, ripping open the packaging on the sidewalk, sliding them on right there without going home first. One of those rings went into the ground with Minnie in 1999. It has been on her finger for 27 years, in the grave where Kimberly's aunt visits every single week. The other one is still out there. Minor Soriano wanted to touch the stars. The man who stopped her spent 22 years pretending to show them to children. In the end, the stars didn't save him. A dead man's DNA did, and a girl who was thrown away like garbage made history from her grave and forced an entire city to reckon with how it hunts its killers.